Alright, welcome. In this video I want to show you how I got an NPC chat system working out. So I'll first show you how it works. I've set up three NPCs here, three archer NPCs, and I'm controlling the footmen, and I can speak with these NPCs. Maybe I'll start by just maybe walking too far away and clicking on one of them, and I've just got a simple message here saying, okay, you're too far away to chat with this person. Alright, so I'll continue. And then I will maybe talk to my different agents here. This one's name is Charlene. We're playing a game. If you want, you should talk to Alice. All right, I will continue. Is this Alice? No, this is Bob. I'm playing a game with my friends. If you want to play, talk to Alice. Okay, so I'm going to go talk to Alice, assuming this is Alice. Alice, hello friend. I'm playing a game with my friends Bob and Charlene. Do you want to play with us? Yes, no, goodbye. I'm going to say yes. Great. One of them only lies and the other only tells the truth. I'm trying to figure out which is which. You should speak to them to find out. All right, I'll be right back. Okay, now I'm going to go talk to Bob again. Bob says, hello friend, ask me any question you like. Okay, do you always tell the truth? Yes, of course. Okay, I have more questions then. Does Charlene always tell the truth? No, never. Okay, well, I'm going to maybe believe Bob and go say, well, Bob says he's telling the truth, so I'll talk to Alice. And she says, oh, you should still speak to Charlene. Okay, I'll go talk to Charlene then, see what she has to say. All right, Charlene, do you always tell the truth, Charlene? Yes, I do. That's what Bob said too. I have more questions. Does Bob always tell the truth? No, he's a big liar. Okay, so they're both saying that they're telling the truth, and they're both saying that the other one's a liar. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? If you're a liar, you would say that you tell the truth, and the other one is the liar too. So I have more questions. So I've actually put a third question on here because this is a question that will expose the liar and expose the truth teller. Let's see here. Do both you and Bob always tell the truth? So let's ask Charlene. She says, no, one of us is a liar. Now that is the truth, because what Alice told us at the beginning is one of them is a liar and one of them is telling the truth. That means Charlene must be telling the truth. I think I've got the answer, but let's just double check. We'll go talk to Bob as well, and we'll ask him the special question as well. Do both you and Charlene always tell the truth? He says, yes, we do. Well, that's because he's lying. He's a liar. He's saying that they both tell the truth, but really he's a liar. All right, that should be enough for me to figure out the puzzle. So I will now go over to Alice again. Alice says, who is the liar? It was Bob. So I'll pick Bob. You're correct. Congratulations. Great, thanks. That was fun. Okay, and then maybe I'll talk to them again, and they just say, thank you for playing with us. Yeah, that was fun. I enjoyed being the liar. And what a fun game. Okay, so the purpose of this video is to show you how I've set up the code trees and so on that will allow us to branch through the different text, also display the text, and then keep track of the state as we go, the state of the game. Basically, we had a simple sort of guessing game here that we needed to keep track of. So before I set up my demo here, I sat down on the whiteboard and I decided what the structure of the game was going to be. And so I had to sit down and think, okay, I was going to play this sort of knights and knaves games. And I wanted to have a few stages in the game, you know, before the game gets started, and then, you know, while the game is proceeding, there were a few different stages. And then I wanted there after the game, we just have sort of the final state. And to do that, I've actually used this state machine. So this is a state diagram. If you're familiar with state diagrams, each of these sort of circles here is a state that our system could be in. In this case, maybe it's my footman could be in. And then the arrows and the transitions here are ways to move from one state to another based on certain conversations is basically what these are. And I've got a little shorthand here and I'm going to explain it to you. And this little arrow pointing in here means this is the first state or the initial state. So when we start at the initial state. I'm calling it state 1. Actually in my code I called it state 0. but I'll call it state 1 for now. And this first little arrow here, this looping arrow here says, as long as I just talk to Bob or Charlene, I'll stay in state 1. Or if I talk to Alice and I say no. So Alice is going to ask, hey, do you want to play with us? If I say no, I'll just stay in state 1. I guess if I said no, I could just jump to state 6 that said, you know, we're done. Or have another state that said I didn't play. But for now, I just had it loop. Maybe I'll come back and ask again. And if I talk to Alice again and then I say yes, that will switch me into state 2. Now that state transition was there because before I started playing the game, I want Bob and Charlene to just ignore me basically. And then once I agree to play the game, then I can go talk to Bob and Charlene. Now once I'm playing the game, you'll see here on states 2, 3, and 4, if I talk to Alice in those states, Alice basically just sends me back out and says, go talk to Bob and Charlene. But in these states, I'm basically keeping track of who I've talked to so far. So after talking to Alice and joining the game, if I talk to Bob, I will enter into state 3. That's keeping track of the fact that I've talked to Bob, but not Charlene yet. And then if I talk to Charlene after that, I will enter into state 5, which is now I've talked to both of them. The other path here that going through state 4 is just if I happen to choose to talk to Charlene first and then Bob, I want to be able to remember who I've talked to and who I haven't, and so I need these different states to do that. However, once I've talked to everyone, Alice will allow me to guess. So again, if I keep talking to Bob and Charlene, I can keep asking them the questions in case I need more information. But once I talk to Alice, I can make my guess, and that will enter me into the last step. Either I win or I lose based on my guess. Alice actually here also had an option to go ask more questions. So there is actually a self loop here that I didn't draw on here for Alice if I said I'm not done yet. But if you talk to Alice and you make the guess, you'll enter to the last state. And then I just put a little self loop on that last state, meaning that once I'm in the last state, no matter who I talk to, I just stay in the last state. So we're sort of at a dead end here. So this was my design that I decided beforehand what I wanted to model in my game. And so now I'm going to show you how I implemented that in the code. So again, this is called a state machine. So this is the states that our agent might be in as they're transferring through the game. This might be the states of a quest that you might have in your game, you know, before the quest, now that you have the quest, doing the quest, and then afterwards you finish the quest. So we're going to have to implement this state machine somehow in our code. But one thing that I should probably make more clear here is that we're not actually going to have like a state object and transition objects in the same way we might, you know, implement a graph. Even though I've used a graph to represent this visually, I am just going to use one variable in my code to keep track of the state. And then I'm going to transition through the state by just making changes to that variable, by changing the 1 to the 2 or the 2 to the 3 and so on. And so it's going to be quite simple to implement this, but we need to have it conceptually in our mind ahead of time. And so it's usually worthwhile to draw yourself a little picture like this or a bigger picture than this, outlining all the different states and the way you can move between them in your game. All right, the first thing I've done is I've set aside a little extra piece of the web page for all my chat to happen in a little additional chat window. And this is not a canvas. And the reason I've chosen to do that is because if you want to draw arbitrary text on the canvas, like I've just been drawing arbitrary text in this window, and you want it to be spaced nicely, and you want it to, you know, use word wrap and wrap down to the next line and so on, that's actually a little bit tricky. You're going to have to write your own little text handler for the canvas. And so usually when I'm doing this, if I have to write arbitrary text, I use HTML elements instead. And so what I've actually used is just div elements. So first I'll show you how I've set up this little pink area where all my text is going to be displayed. So here we are inside the HTML file, and you can see here that the canvas, this is our normal canvas element that we've been using to do our games. And for this example, I've decided to make it 600, 600 just to make it a little smaller, give us some room for the text to pop up. And then I've wrapped it in another element, a div element and I've made it twice as wide. And then I've used the flex ability, so the display here for flex, which will allow us to fill the rest of this div element with our second element here, this div element. And then inside that div element, I've gone ahead and I've created four more div elements here. One for the actual chat message, the message being displayed, and then I've made space for 3 different responses, although I could set it up to have more than that if I wanted. And the other thing you'll notice is that all of these are empty. The whole thing is empty. So at the moment, all of these are not displayed. The actual div element is being displayed. It's empty. And I've gone ahead and I've made its background color pink so that when I display it, we can just see it. So I've just tried to make the background color different for each of my elements so that it's easier for us to visualize this. You might want to go back and change this to white, or better yet, go back and put some actual style on it to make it look nice. The other 3 styles that I've really set up here is this div. This is going to be where the text is displayed in the chat, and then I have where a response is going to be displayed. When the response is displayed, I want the color of the text to be gray and the background in this case to be light green. But then if I hover over it, I'm just using the normal CSS hover mechanic here, that when I hover over it, I will just change the color to black, and then that way you can see sort of which response you are hovering over. Otherwise, what we're going to do with these div elements is whenever I need to draw some text on the screen, whenever we're engaged in a chat, I'm going to grab these elements by their IDs. So here I've called them message, response 1, 2, and 3, and then I'm going to dump some text into their inner HTML. So let's see how I do that. To do that, I've actually just built this little helper function here called load chat. And what load chat's going to do is I'm going to pass into it a little object, and that object's going to have inside of it a message and a response 1, 2, and 3. And these response 1, 2s, and 3s are going to be a little bit more complicated. They're not just the text that you would put in the response, but also what we do when we click on those buttons. And so I'll show you more about that in a second. But all we can see here is that they reach in there and grab out the text element, and then up here I just grab the message itself. The message is just another text element, and we just stuff this into the inner HTML of the elements that we just fetched out. So remember, we named them message, response 1, response 2, and response 3. So here I'm just using the get element by ID to grab those out, and then again writing the inner HTML. What that does is it changes the HTML in the actual web page. So we're dynamically changing the web page while we're looking at it. So we'll change what's displayed in that div element from, well, nothing when it's initialized to whatever it is in this message. Or if we're in the middle of a chat, it will just change whatever the message used to be to what the new message is. So I'll use that. The extra logic I have up here is just if I call this with nothing, then I want it to display nothing. And so this is just a little extra logic to make sure it displays nothing in that case. The only other thing I've got going on here is, I guess I'm missing a semicolon there too, but this is a variable that I've set up. It's global at the moment because in my demo I should probably build this into my main character if I was going to have a main character, or whatever is tracking the state of all your quests, if you have a quest object, something like that. But for now I've just made it global, and this is keeping track of the current state of the chat, and this is going to allow us to navigate to other chats as we're going through the conversation tree. So that maybe raises the question, what is a conversation tree? So I've, again, had to sort of decide ahead of time, and you need to put a little bit of design into this to think about how you want your conversations to be set up. But the way that I envision my conversation, at least to start out, is as a tree of nodes, where in each node, my NPC that I'm talking with says something to me, and then I, the user, get to select a response from some options. Now, each of those options is going to be like a branch in a tree, branching me to the next node in the conversation. And so this is sort of like a choose your own adventure. We need to write all the possible branches. We need to know all the ways we can go. And then on top of that, I've been envisioning this as a tree, but it's possible that it's actually a graph, meaning that we might want some of our nodes to join back up again or to loop back to the back again, and so on. And so we are going to actually set this up as a graph, but for the moment, I just want to think about this as a tree. So let's just look at the very simplest one I have here. Here I've set up this error code. This is the one that just tells me I'm too far away to chat with this person. And this is going to be a very simple one. You can see I'm defining the object on the fly here. Built right into it are those three components that we expected or that we saw in our helper function there. It's going to have the message, it's going to have the response 1, response 2, and response 3. And at least for the simple part here, I've built in for each of my responses just the text of what should be displayed on the little button or the div element that I'm going to be clicking on when I want to make that response. So this is a very simple one. The message says you're too far away to chat with this person, and then there's only one response, which is just continue, and so I've just defaulted the other two to empty string, which will make sure they are not displayed. Now let's look at what I've built up for Alice. This first one is going to be the conversation tree for when we first talk to Alice when we're in the first state. I will talk a little bit more about the state transitions in a second. So we'll just look at the first conversation tree. In this case, when I talk to Alice the first time, she says, "Hello friend, I'm playing a game with my friends Bob and Charlene. Do you want to play with us?" And there were three responses available. There is response 1, yes, response 2, no, and response 3, goodbye. And response 3, goodbye, is the simplest, and you'll notice the way I've designed this, that if the conversation ends at this point in the tree, all I have in the response is text, which means that's the text that will be displayed on the button, but if I click it, the conversation is just done, so there's nothing else there. Otherwise, if the conversation is going to continue, then I'm going to have a next. And the next is going to be another object of the same kind that we were just defining there. That is, it should be another conversation node, and these conversation nodes are defined by having a message object and 3 response objects. And so that's what we've got here. So in my next, I'm going to say, okay, Alice has a response. Okay, great. She explains the game to us. And then, again, I set it up for having two responses. Technically, both of these should start the game, so I'm going to do this here. Because what this response is going to do is it's going to have the text, and then it doesn't have a next like we've got set up here. I could have a long chain of these, and inside each of these I could have next and next and next. And if you're going to have a long conversation tree, you might actually end up setting up a very deep tree of conversations. If you're going to do that, you might want to do it slightly different than I'm doing it here, which is just defining it on the fly. But in this case, the other thing I put on there was the state transition. This just tells me what state I should move into if I click on this response. Again, I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. My second response was no, and again, it also has a next conversation node in the conversation tree. She says, okay, then peace out, and you can say goodbye, and you can move on. But if you say goodbye, Alice says nothing, that's it. You're off. You can go back and interact with other members. Now, this is the tree now. We can think of this as a tree because we've got the main node here, which is this main node, and then inside that main node, we have 2 children nodes declared as nexts here. And then those ones could have inside each of these responses could have nexts as well, and inside each of those responses could have nexts, so on, as far down as you might like to go. Now I've gone ahead and defined all of these branches. The second thing I've done is you'll notice that this object that I've defined here is defined inside a list. Here I'm making it inside a list, and that's because the real thing I'm defining for Alice, this Alice variable here, is that it's going to be a list of trees where each tree is a conversation tree of all the possible branches I could have from that conversation, and the root of that tree is going to be the start of the conversation for that state. So this first one is going to be state 0, and this is going to be the conversation tree for state 0. The next entry in my list is going to be the tree for state 1, the next state. So here again, remember, if I transition to the next state, state 1, then that means the next time I talk to Alice, I will enter into this conversation tree. You'll notice that this tree is a very narrow tree, or a short tree. It just says, hey, come back when you go play the game, go talk to Bob and Charlene. And again, remember, I set up these separate states for whether we've talked to Bob or Charlene. And so the next one says, oh, you should still speak with Charlene, because that means you have spoken to Bob, but you haven't spoken to Charlene. If you are in this state, state 3 or 4 in our diagram, then that means we've spoken to Charlene but not Bob. So we remind our player to go speak to Bob. And then finally, after that, when we're in the next state, that means we've spoken to both Charlene and Bob, and this is going to be the conversation tree that we start off for the guessing game. So can you guess if you're correct or not? And then the last entry that we have in here is just going to be the final state, which is, remember, the dead end state, which is just basically saying thank you for playing. Now, for Bob and Charlene, I wanted the option for you to be able to loop through their questions. Basically, you should be able to ask them their questions over and over again and get the same answers, hopefully. And so to do that, instead of having a conversation tree, I wanted to have a conversation graph where we can loop back to the same node over and over again, even though we're going to go through a couple other intermediary nodes on the way there. And so to do that, we can't just define it all on the fly like we did with Alice. Instead, I'm going to make a special variable out here called Bob's questions, which is going to be the node that you're at when you ask Bob his questions. And so here we have, he says, okay, ask me any question you like. And the 3 responses I have are the 3 questions that are available to ask Bob. Do you always tell the truth? Does Charlene always tell the truth? And do both of you always tell the truth? And then I have the 3 responses that Bob would have in those situations. And then to get the looping back up, I've set up this I have more questions response. And the idea is then if we click on this one, we should come back to this exact node. And so what I could be doing here is I could be doing, all right, I could do a next again, and then put this whole node again, just to cut and paste all the way in there. But I want to do this infinite times because I want to loop it back. And so that's not going to do what I want. So instead what I'm going to do here, and also I could do something here like this, next Bob questions. Because this is really what I want, is I want this next entry to reference back to this whole node again. So just come back to the same node again. However, at this point, when we get to this point in the execution of the code, Bob's questions is not defined yet. We're still defining it. So this would not do what we want it to do. It would instead make next equal to undefined. So instead, after I've set up this variable Bob's questions down here, I go in, and you can sort of follow with me, I go into response 1, I go into the next, I go into response 1, and I make it have a next, and I just set it up to be Bob's questions again. So I set that loop up after Bob's questions is defined, otherwise this reference would still be undefined and we wouldn't get what we want. So I go ahead and I do that for the 3 responses, all 3 of them. I just set that loop up, and now I've got this node here, Bob's questions, that will loop back to itself. And that way I can go and insert this conversation tree into Bob's list of conversation trees and in the appropriate points. Now, because I'm keeping track of whether I've spoken to Bob and Charlene, and these are different states, the only difference here between this definition, Bob questions, and Bob's questions 2 is the state that I transition to afterwards. Okay, I've changed that state instead of 4. So no matter what, when I ask Bob questions, I'm going to record that I've spoken to Bob now. And so I will normally, if I am in the initial state that I've just talked to Alice and I've just started the game, then I'll want to move into state 2. Otherwise, if I went and talked to Charlene already, I'm going to want to move into state 4. And if I've talked to both Charlene and Bob before, I'm going to stay in state 4. So I'm going to keep that transition there. So that's the only difference I've got there. Now, you might ask, well, isn't this bad? We're duplicating a lot of code. It is kind of bad to duplicate a lot of code here. But if I try to use the same technique I'm using here to go in and modify this afterwards to say change it to 4, that would change it to 4 in the references I set up in the original Bob's questions as well. So the ones that I had originally set to 2 would get overwritten with 4s, and I wouldn't want that, so I'm just going to set 2 different. Basically, we need a deep copy here instead of a shallow copy, and so I've set up a deep copy with Bob's questions 2. That's basically doing the exact same thing. So now when I set up Bob, I set up his initial conversation tree, which is only 1 layer deep, because he basically says go away until you talk to Alice. And then when he's in the first 2 states, I just call Bob's questions. If he's in the next 2 states, I call Bob's questions 2. And remember, they're exactly the same except that they say transition into different states. And then my final state was, okay, that was fun, saying thank you for playing. So Charlene is actually set up the exact same way. I set up Charlene's question so that I can loop. I set up Charlene's questions 2 because I have to transition into state 4 after I've spoken to both of them. And then I've got the same sort of setup here. There's only one little difference here. We do Charlene's questions for the first state of these 4, but not the second. We immediately switch into Charlene's questions 2 in that state. All right, now that I've defined Alice, Bob, and Charlene, the variables that are their lists of conversation trees, I go ahead when I create my new archers, I just tell them where they belong, and then I pass in those conversation trees for them. I use those conversation trees in the update to decide if we've clicked on a particular archer, which conversation to start up. So here I've just got a very simple bit of logic here that if there is a click, so I record the click in my game engine, and then if there's a click, I check to see if the click is on me by just repurposing my collision detection that I had from an earlier video. This is just circle-to-circle collision detection, and I've just set up the click to have a radius of 0, and so I'm just trying to see if the circle, my bounding circle for my archer, is colliding with the click. If it is, then that means the click's on me, and that means this archer should handle it. So then we go into the body where it handles it. So then I just check to see how far away this archer is from the footman. If it is less than the visual radius, then that means we can have a conversation. So we load up a chat, and we load up this .chats. This .chats is what we loaded in the list of conversation trees. And then we just grab the state of the footman. The footman is recording my state for me. That's the state of the conversation of the game. And so I go grab that state to tell me which of the conversation trees to load up. And then otherwise, if I wasn't close enough, I just load up the error message saying I'm not close enough. So this is, for the most part, the simple logic I have. Click on the archer, start up the tree, but then how does the tree work? Well, the tree is a tree. We're going to navigate it basically by clicking on different responses and nodes in it. So I've done that by just going to grab those 3 buttons I set up. Remember, I set them up as div elements. They're not actually buttons, but I gave them the names response 1, response 2, and response 3, and that way I can just grab them using this document.getElementById. I'll go grab each one of them, and then each one of them, now I'm doing this right in my main, right at the beginning. So before I do anything, I've just set up my canvas. I haven't started my game engine or created anything yet. The very first thing I do is I grab those div elements and I set up these listeners. Now these listeners are almost exactly the same. I could probably have refactored this into just a single object or a single method call. But the only difference between them is that I'm making changes to, or I'm looking at the response 1, the response 2, or the response 3 of the current chat node that we're looking at. Now remember, this is going to be a current conversation node, so it's going to have a message and its 3 responses, response 1, 2, and 3, and that this logic here is going to handle both. When I click on it, I'm going to move into the new state, so change the footman state into the new state if there is one. And if there's a next conversation to be loaded, we will load the next node. So we load the next node into the chat, and that will load it up, and that will again also set the current chat to the next node as well. Otherwise, we just load nothing. When I call load chat with nothing in it, that just empties the chat window. So I've just set that up for all 3 of these here. When we click on the response, it will switch to the next state if there is one, and it will load the next conversation again if there is one. All right, I hope this video has given you some ideas of how you can set up some NPC chat trees and dialogue windows in your own games. So thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you in that next video.